to do today is continue our exploring of the world of the fairy story, and we're going to have a look at what is arguably one of the most famous, one of the most popular stories. There are many different versions, and some of them aimed very deliberately at children, and some of them arguably aimed at a slightly older audience. In addition, there have been many film versions made of this particular story, some of them again most decidedly aimed at adults, and others aimed at children. For me, the story of Cinderella is aimed at both audiences. There is most decidedly an element that only a child can relate to, and there is also most decidedly an element that perhaps we should be relating to as adults. It's a fascinating story. In origin, it's probably Chinese, but not that this is particularly important, because it is in the Chinese philosophy that the doctrine of the small foot has come to signal great physical beauty. What it is, and all the versions are centered around this, it's a story of hope. That there is hope for the child in its negotiation of the incredibly complex and often difficult process of what we call growing up. That we negotiate the pitfalls, the quite extraordinary difficulties that are put in front of us of the journey between birth and, let us say, just as a kind of a cut-off point, and that can be argued, puberty. I'm going to use one of the sort of standard versions, the version that you will find most common. And it centers around a girl called Cinderella. In most versions, we do not actually learn her real name. She is there as Cinderella. And essentially the story revolves around the fact that she has lost her mother. Her father was married well, and it's hinted that the marriage was a good marriage, and that Cinderella grew up in a happy and centered environment. And then one day, for, again, in most of the stories, no apparent reason, the mother dies or vanishes. She leaves. On the face of it, there's not too much mourning of her going. She just goes. The father is a good man, but he also tends to vanish from the story and not have too much to do with it as it develops. And the story centers on Cinderella and the relationship with her new mother that inevitably the father marries. What the new mother, the stepmother, the wicked stepmother, and stepmothers are usually wicked in the fairy stories, brings with her are two daughters of her own. These two are portrayed as wicked, rather nasty, self-centered, narcissistic. There's a whole lot of adjectives that one can apply to them. And they turn on Cinderella with an extraordinary viciousness. And it is out of that that we now come to get her name, Cinderella, the girl of the cinders. Because that's what she does. She cleans the grates, deals with the cinders, as opposed to the ashes. And that's another discussion in itself. And she's at their beck and call. She has to sew for them. She has to make sure that their clothing is always neat, that the food is cooked. And all in all, Cinderella sinks into the depths of despair. She allows herself to be degraded. Interestingly enough, there's a strong psychological accent behind that as children, we do allow ourselves to be degraded. One of the ways in which this is patently done and very obviously done is how our parents diminish our names. Edward becomes Eddie, and so on and so forth. Christopher becomes Chris. It's an extraordinary process. There are many reasons for this, and those are things that we can discuss and explore at some later stage. To get back to the story, Cinderella is in the depths of despair, not knowing what to do. And of course, in the story, there is the prince, this mythical creature that exists in obviously a certain degree of opulence in this magic castle somewhere else. And Cinderella dreams of this, as do the two ugly sisters, as well as the ugly stepmother. But it is portrayed as quite unattainable. Quite unattainable. And then one day, the door opens just a crack. And it turns out that the prince has now decided that it is time he found a wife. So he plans to throw a ball and invite all the eligible young ladies of his realm so that he can view them. This is very paternalistic. This is very animus-oriented, that the women must now parade themselves for the approval of the seeking male. The family, of course, the wicked stepmother, her two daughters, and Cinderella get themselves into a right tiswas, a froth of excitement. Cinderella, of course, assumes that she is going. She is, after all, one of the maidens of the realm. That picture is soon dashed by the wicked stepmother and the stepsisters, who say, of what possible value could she add? The prince would obviously have absolutely no interest in her whatsoever. Does this sound vaguely familiar, perhaps? At any rate, Cinderella is again harried from point A to point B, as she primps and sews to make the stepsisters seem as pretty as they can. Of course, in most stories, the stepsisters are quite ugly, so the task is essentially hopeless. But Cinderella is forced to do her best. And again, she sinks even deeper into despair, as the prince and all that he represents recedes even further away from what is possible for her. And then one day, while Cinderella is weeping copiously, pop, and it's beautifully portrayed in some of the better films, and pop, here comes the fairy godmother. Magic. And she has magical powers. And she says to Cinderella, "What's the matter, child?" And Cinderella confesses to her and tells her what's going on. And the fairy godmother, the magical creature, says, "Don't be silly. This is not an issue. We can take care of this very easily." And the magic day arrives, and the stepsisters and the stepmother are duly primped and coiffed, and off they go. And Cinderella sits, and then all of a sudden, again, pop, here comes the fairy godmother. And she takes care of everything. A pumpkin is materialized that is turned into a coach. Some animals, and this relationship between us and the animal world is important, and it's one that we shall explore in greater depth, are turned magically into creatures that can be used and useful to us. I think it's the rats that become footmen, the newts become horses, or is it the other way around? It doesn't really matter. And then the dénouement, the gown. Again, the fairy godmother waves her wand, and Cinderella is beautifully clothed from hand to foot, and all her inner beauty is revealed through the outer manifestation of the gown. And the final magical touch, the glass slipper. There's quite a lot written about this glass slipper, but let's just accept it for our purposes here today. And off Cinderella goes. And of course, she is the belle of the ball, the most beautiful girl. The prince is smitten and spends most of the evening dancing with her, and everybody else's nose, particularly the stepsisters and the stepmother, is horribly out of joint. They don't recognize Cinderella, of course, and the evening is quite magical. There was a hook, as there usually is in life. Because the fairy godmother says to Cinderella, I will create all this for you, but remember, my dear, you must be back here before the clock finishes striking 12. And of course, in the excitement, Cinderella forgets. And then the clock starts to strike. 1, 2. And she wakes up with a start, detaches herself from the prince, and hurtles out of the ballroom. The prince, of course, is totally amazed. And there are several versions here as to what actually happens. We'll stick to the simple one. In her haste, as she trips down the stairs and hurtles into the ex-pumpkin, the carriage, she loses one of the slippers. Now, whether she actually makes it back or is spewed out of the pumpkin halfway home, again, it's not all that relevant. She gets back home. And eventually, the stepmother and the 2 stepsisters arrive, and they are irritated, in a bad mood. And of course, Cinderella cops the lot. After all, who was this extraordinary creature that dominated and captivated the prince so? But it seems to be over. And then, once again, the door opens a crack. Life. The prince finds the slipper. And he realizes, maybe there's a way that he can actually track down this beautiful goddess that so enchanted him. And he instructs his staff that they are to go throughout the realm with this slipper and attempt to fit it to the foot of all the maidens that were at the ball. So once again, the family is plunged into a tiswas. And in due time, the officials arrive at the house. And the 2 maidens present themselves and, in vain, attempt to fit the slipper. In some versions, they even go so far as to attempt to cut their foot, literally, to fit the slipper. And there's a question. How often, as children, do we attempt a process of self-mutilation so that we can, in one way or another, both literal and metaphorical, so that we can fit into the life that we believe we have to fit into? Of course, it's quite hopeless. And one of the officials says, no, hold on. There's another maiden in this house, isn't there? And in a blustery way, the stepmother says, the 2 daughters say, no, she's of no account. The prince couldn't possibly interest her. And the official stands his ground and says, no, the instructions are quite clear. All maidens must fit the slipper. And of course, surprise, surprise, the slipper fits. In some versions, the slipper actually leaps out of the official's hand and makes its way to Cinderella's foot. The stepmother and the two stepsisters are, to put it mildly, put out. But Cinderella is whisked away to the palace, where she finally embraces the prince. Perhaps it's simply the magical aspect of herself that she has kept so long buried. Not necessarily a real flesh and blood man. And of course the story unfolds, and in due time they are married, and then, as is the case in all fairy stories, they live happily ever after. And of course that's really the point. One of the major points of the fairy story for us is that it offers hope. For apart from being this necessity to degrade ourselves, it is absolutely okay to yearn for that prince, for that fitting into life. And this is the power of the fairy story. But for the child, this is what is offered. And it is beautifully portrayed in the story of Cinderella and the wicked stepmother and the two sisters. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to continuing our journey with you.